Oui, bon, ça va faire jamais le même switch. Tu poses encore voilà. En tout cas, c'est bien l'emplacement, tout ça, bravo. C'est ta fille. C'est bien. Oui, il faisait moins que toi. Il était toujours pas mal. Tu as commencé à nous envoyer des photos. Je pense que tu as été trop bien. Cet endroit-là, le peintre, on a récupéré. Non, mais c'est oui, là où l'autre est ça qui est bien,
Das will eine Romandie, ist
oui, bon, voilà, le minimum. Bonjour. Bonjour.
What they can get.
Yeah.
So far away, kind of. They
Yes.
About not going too quickly into the front. No, not that I haven't got anything. Yeah, New York is still very discreet.
Maintenant, tu as vaguement reconnu.
like writing stuff, there's quite a bit out. We were just talking about the task. We're like, okay, there it's picking up, but maybe not yet in the events and kind of.
But it sounded
Ah non, 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 moi je vais envoyer ces textes.
Last time, too, down towards the last meeting, the very last minute.
C'est pas la marque.
Comment?
I think yes, something might be maybe to take
Okay, do you have any?
Mr. Moderator, where do you want to see whom? I think you could already come up with
Well, everybody has a microphone, so it's, I don't know, so I kind of sit, I sit on the side, because then I can see everybody. I think kind of this actually, I found it pretty helpful. Right, so I just go over there, and then, I don't know where each of you wants to, Maybe from the beginning, maybe it's good that you're at the podium, and then, but maybe No, let's sit here. I mean, we only have the few opening remarks now. I think we can sit here, then we avoid later meetings.
Trying to figure out where I need to drop something over.
Bonjour, good afternoon. It is my pleasure to welcome here you at Maison de la Paix to this event co-organized by Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Geneva Office, the Graduate Institute's International Law Department, and the Global Governance Center. Who can lead a disarrayed world? Well, let me extend a warm welcome to the speakers who will get at that question with us over the next hour and a half. Anjali Dayal, Robert Piper, and Laurel Townhead, who will be introduced by our moderator, Professor Nico Krisch, in just a minute. In the opening, let me just say some words also on behalf of my organization, the Geneva Human Rights Platform, what brought us to this discussion today. So obvious, the dates. The current term of the Secretary General ends on the 31st of December 2026. In accordance with Article 97 of the Charter of the UN, the Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council. And this, as you might all imagine, has surely not become easier as the UN is currently under ever-increasing financial and political pressure, exacerbated by the general loss of legitimacy and trust that the rules-based international order faces, accompanied or actually triggered also by a rise of populism and autocratic governments around the globe. The election process has to take place in the coming year, and actually, even if the race isn't opened yet, we do see already a good dozen of names circulating. Speaking of names, Trygve Lie, Dag Hammarskjöld, U Thant, Kurt Waldheim, Javier Pérez de Cuellar, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, Antonio Guterres. All those great men have led the United Nations throughout its 80 years of existence. So one point now is certain. The next Secretary General has to be a woman. But aside from this, many uncertainties prevail. The election of a new Secretary General of the UN is falling in a time, as I said, of deep uncertainty at the UN and a general re-questioning of multilateralism by big hegemonial powers. There is also the ongoing UN 80 initiative involving restructuring and budget cuts. This is also impacting international Geneva, including the UN's human rights system, on which I would like to just focus for a moment, as the Geneva Human Rights Platform is working very tightly with this system, trying to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of it. Volker Türk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, spoke 2 weeks ago at a meeting at the Human Rights Council, and he mentioned that all 3 work streams of the UN80 initiative have an impact on human rights. Work Stream 1 on identifying and implementing operational and management efficiencies, Work Stream 2 on mandate implementation review, and Work Stream 3 on changing structures and realigning programs. And we see also organizations based here in International Geneva now being under the pressure, some of them probably being combined, being folded together, being reduced, being removed. We don't really know where things are going yet. A financial analysis of the UN80 initiative by the International Service for Human Rights also finds lately that the proposed budget cuts are disproportionately hitting the human rights pillar, about 15 to 17% compared to 12 to 13 in the pillars of development and security. And the UN reform will have, obviously, to be taken further by the next Secretary General. So what does that mean also for us here? And as Professor Ayal remarks in the study that will be discussed today, the next UN Secretary General will have the opportunity to shore up support for multilateralism and global norms around peace, security, and human rights at a time when these arrangements and values are waning among many other powerful world actors. And will have to address these challenges at a time of deep fiscal crisis for the institution. I believe the next Secretary General has to put more attention on the human rights stool to develop it financially really into a pillar. She also definitely should be a world leader guided by the UN Charter and the standards of international law, including human rights law, but maybe, as Professor Dayal also reflects, be not too outspoken on human rights during the election year. With these thoughts, I'm handing over to Renate Tenbusch, Director of the Geneva office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, to start us into the topic of the discussion. So Renate, if you'd like to come and take the floor here. Thank you.
Take the steps.
Yes.
Avoiding accidents. Yes, thanks a lot, Felix. It's also my great pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Geneva, and I would also like to especially welcome Professor Anjali Dalal from New York's Fordham University. Dear Anjali, let me congratulate you on your brilliant analysis of the role and the election process of the next UN Secretary General that you are going to present to us in a minute. I would also like to welcome our other panelists, Robert Piper and Laurel Townend, and our moderator, Nico Krisch. And obviously, I'm also welcoming the audience. I'm delighted that you all accepted our invitation to what I believe is a very timely discussion, organized together, as we heard from our partners, the Graduate Institute's International Law Department and the Global Governance Center. Ladies and gentlemen, organizing a public event like this is something rather new for the FES Geneva. Usually we host roundtables, seminars, trainings, or side events with experts, diplomats, politicians, trade unionists, civil society representatives, and delegations from the Global South, focusing on human rights, trade, migration, and decent work and social justice. But as we heard before, times have changed. Multilateralism, with the UN at its core, is under serious threat. For this reason, we at FES Geneva decided that it is time to open our conversations to the broader public, here in Geneva as well as in New York, and to engage in debate about the developments that concern us most regarding the UN system and the profound shifts in global politics. To underline this new approach, we renamed our liaison offices in both New York and Geneva from simply UN offices to offices on the United Nations and Global Dialogue. Just 2 weeks ago, my colleague Matthias Pesch, who oversees our global trade portfolio, and I attended a conference jointly organized by our 2 offices together with the Institute for Development and Policy in New York, headed by Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz. Together with well-known experts and representatives from academia, the labor movement, and politics from around the world, we explored what an alternative, progressive global trade system could look like. And we are planning to bring this conversation back to Geneva next year. Last week, we held a public debate here in Geneva on How Africa Eats with Professor David Luke from the London School of Economics. How Africa Trades and How Africa Eats are two books in a series edited by Professor Luke and supported by FES. At the event, we discussed the relationship between global trade and food security in the African context, together with panelists from the World Food Programme, the International Union of Food, and the World Trade Organization. And today, we are very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Anjali Dayal, who will discuss with us the election of the next UN Secretary General, a process that will unfold next year, and her study that was first launched and discussed in New York at an event under Chatham House rules and attended by New York UN diplomats. The event was organized by our colleagues from the New York office, who also commissioned this study. I think we can all agree that the upcoming election will be decisive for the future of the UN and its role in world affairs. Some argue that the UN should return to its core mandate of peace and security. Others call for a more transparent, participatory, balanced, and effective UN system centered around a reformed Security Council that reflects shifting global dynamics and ensures fair representation. To steer the UN through this moment of profound global change, the organization needs leadership that is not only strong, but broadly accepted and trusted. This means that who is elected, and equally how he or she is elected, matters enormously. And that it should be a she, we just heard also from our colleagues Felix, and I think we will hear that again in the panel discussion. Just a few weeks ago in New York, I attended the book launch and keynote conversation with Tan Minh Yu at NYU's Center on International Cooperation. Tan Minh Yu, himself a former UN official, tells the story of his grandfather, U Thant, the third UN Secretary General, and his quiet but remarkably influential diplomacy during the 1960s. I think there was a similar event here in Geneva in October during the Human Rights Council. However, for those who didn't attend the event and haven't yet read the book, which I can recommend, let me share with you quickly. U Thant came into office first as an acting Secretary General following the tragic death of famous Dag Hammarskjöld in a plane crash, and was confirmed a year later in the official election process. Coming from a small country like Burma, and with a humble background as a former school teacher who rose through public service only after Burma's independence, U Thant was an unlikely candidate. Yet, it was precisely these qualities, his modesty, neutrality, and lack of great power baggage, that made him the rare figure acceptable to both superpowers, while also earning the support of newly independent nations of the global south. During his decade at the helm, he played key roles in navigating crises such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Congo crisis, and the Six-Day War, relying on moral authority, patient negotiation, and quiet diplomacy. He championed decolonization, advocated for a fairer international order, focused more and more also on the environment, and worked within the constraints of the UN system with a rare steadiness and principle. He was a pragmatist and, for a diplomat, very transparent and clear in his speech. Perhaps U Thant's surprisingly relative absence from today's public memory has much to do with his leadership style, shaped by his Buddhist background, modest and grounded in the principle of serving from behind. Yet these are precisely the qualities that made him an effective mediator during one of the most polarized eras in modern history. They are also the qualities, I would argue, are urgently needed again today. In a time of global power plays, disinformation, persistent and escalating conflicts, and a United Nations whose norms, principles, values, and goals, in particular international law, human rights, as well as the SDGs, are under serious threat, and the institutions and processes must be fundamentally reformed. With this in mind, let me close by extending my heartfelt thanks to my team at FES, Matthias, Sabine, and Elena, to Felix Kirchmeier from the Graduate Institute, as well as our partner Global Governance Center for organizing, cooperating, and hosting this event, to our distinguished panelists and our moderator, and to you, our audience, for your interest and engagement. And most importantly, again, to Anjali Dayal for coming all the way from New York to Geneva to share and discuss her findings and thoughts with us here today. And I just learned, I think we haven't had a public debate on the election of the Secretary General next year here in Geneva so far. I think so maybe we are starting and kicking off this debate, which is so important also for what is happening here in Geneva in the future. So thank you for your attention, and now I wish all of us an engaging and thoughtful, provoking conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you for introducing our conversation here. My name is Nico Krisch. I'm a professor of international law here at the Graduate Institute. I also head the International Law Department, and I welcome you very much also on behalf of the Global Governance Center, whose director is here with us today. I thought it was very exciting when Felix came to us asking whether we would want to do this event jointly with the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and the Geneva Human Rights Platform. It is precisely kind of the beauty of the Maison de la Paix that we can bring together a broader audience around questions of international affairs and global governance, and that was precisely the kind of topic we want to talk about. Now, to us, it seems obvious that the election of the Secretary General is an important event, somehow kind of galvanizes attention, even though we're in the early stages, but it's going to do so over the next year, and as the election process moves forward. Obviously, that wasn't always the case, right? In the beginning, in San Francisco, people didn't think this was such a momentous thing. The Secretary General was seen much more as a secretary than as a general, and you see this in the UN Charter, for example, where among the things the General Assembly has to vote on, there's a list of important questions that have to be dealt with by a qualified majority, and there's election to the ECOSOC, election to kind of other bodies are mentioned there, but not the election of the Secretary General. So clearly it was not thought to be among the most important things the General Assembly would do. Now this has changed, and it has changed precisely because of a list of Secretary Generals who have taken the office very seriously and have moved it, broadened its ambit and its visibility in the global realm. And it's precisely because of that that we're now particularly interested in who might succeed Antonio Guterres in this post. And as we heard already, right, that's a particularly difficult time for an election of somebody for this post. It's also a time at which we potentially are most in need of someone who can fulfill a leadership role for a global community that otherwise seems to be fragmenting, seems to be in disarray, as you entitle your study. So it could be more timely to really talk about this, and I'm very happy that we have this excellent panel here with us today. Next to me is Professor Anjali Dayal, Professor of International Politics at Fordham University in New York, who works on the UN, international security, in the UN peace operations. Some of you, hopefully many of you, have seen her book, Incredible Commitments, from a few years back in CUP, How UN Peacekeeping Failures Shape Peace Processes. And she's also, and I can only recommend this to you, the co-host of a podcast about UN affairs, kind of to save us from hell. Very much recommended if you want to be on top of what's going on and have insightful commentary. Then we have Robert Piper, who is a former UN Assistant Secretary General and Special Advisor on Solutions to Internal Displacement. Also former head of the UN Development Coordination Office, Deputy Director at UNDP for Emergency Responses, with 30 years of experience in the UN system, really kind of particularly well placed to talk about the ins and outs of the UN and the politics around Secretary Generals and what they can achieve and how they could be elected. And we have Laura Townhead, who is the director of the Quaker United Nations office in Geneva. She's been the director for many years and has had a distinguished career before or in the UN system, in international organizations, very much with an emphasis on the human rights and humanitarian sector. And so in a sense, it's very fitting that today we hear maybe more from a development perspective from Robert and more from a human rights, humanitarian perspective from Laurel, commenting on the study that we're now going to hear more about. So I'm not going to say more because you haven't come to hear me here today, but you've come to listen to Anjali and our other panelists. So I give you the floor, and I'm looking forward to hear more about the study, Who Can Lead a Disarrayed World? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to FES and the Graduate Institute for organizing this event. As we just heard, right, we're in a historical moment that demands a transformative, creative, and brave UN Secretary General. But we are also in a political moment that is least likely to select a Secretary General that would fulfill that brief, right? We're in a political environment that is most likely to select for candidates who represent their sort of blandest face to the public. But I think, and the sort of argument inherent in this brief is that there may actually be opportunities to fulfill, hopefully, both briefs, right? So I'm going to talk through how these seemingly contradictory goals might play out in the selection process. The brief itself focuses on the characteristics of the office, the political backdrop of the process, and how the political backdrop might inform how different candidates navigate the selection process. Today, I'm also going to touch on a few developments since the brief was published in June, right? Now, to begin with, as we just heard, especially in our discussion of Utante, right, a lot actually depends on the specific personality of the Secretary General because the office is comparatively undefined, right? The office leaves open the way in which the office holder is going to interpret international law and interpret the instructions that are given to the Secretary General by the General Assembly and by the Security Council, right? And as Nico told us, each successive office holder has expanded out the understandings of peace, security, human rights, development that we have today, and has expanded their sort of ability to serve as the face of the international interest, right? Some sort of shared multilateralism that we now identify as being part of the job of the Secretary General, even if it was initially envisioned as primarily an administrative role. So right now we have a singular opportunity to bolster support for multilateralism, for the UN's core principles, and for the shared values of peace, security, and human rights that we've come to identify with our sort of post-World War II moment. Even and especially as support for those arrangements and principles and values wanes across national capitals, right? And even as, I don't have to tell you, right, the UN faces a funding crisis so profound that it threatens its core functions. Now, the selection process also unfolds against two political backdrops that run at cross purposes in some ways. The first is a political context in which the hard right turn in US politics has realigned the Security Council and transformed the United States from the UN's key underwriter to a primary risk generator for the United Nations, excuse me. And second, a political context in which the last two cycles have seen real and meaningful efforts to make the selection process for the Secretary General more transparent, systematic, and democratic, and to elevate a woman to the position of the Secretary General, as we've just heard, right? Now, there's a two-step process for the selection of the Secretary General. It requires any successful candidate for the position to first gain the support of the Security Council and subsequently the support of the General Assembly, or the majority of the General Assembly. This tends to produce a consensus candidate who can survive the Security Council's vetting while still receiving the majority of other member states' votes. And this is a uniquely tricky situation for candidates at the moment, right? This means that what we need to see from a candidate today is someone whose stance, for example, on the Paris Agreement won't actively place the US in opposition to them, but whose stance on the Paris Agreement will also be acceptable to the vast majority of the UN's member member states. Or something that's surprisingly even harder right now, right? Someone who stands on the Sustainable Development Goals won't actively place the US against their candidacy, but who stands on the Sustainable Development Goals will also be broadly acceptable for the majority of the UN's member states who accept it as consensus, right? Now, it's not new for the Secretary General's selection process to unfold against a divided Security Council. Every selection process that unfolded during the Cold War, as we just heard, right, involved trying to reconcile the fundamentally opposed visions of the P5, both with each other and with the broader UN membership. Even Antonio Guterres was selected against the polarization at the Security Council that followed the Syrian civil war and Russia's annexation of Crimea, right? What is new is 4 distinct features of this specific political context today, right? The first is that at least 2 members of the UN Security Council are actively and vocally violating core tenets of the UN Charter, right? Meaning that there's a definitive anti-charter bloc at the Security Council that is itself internally divided. Second, U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration has transformed the United States, as I just said, from a key underwriter of the UN system, from a key funder of the UN system, to a primary risk generator for every dimension of multilateralism, right? Third, a massive funding crisis downstream of these shifts in U.S. foreign policy, not solely, but primarily, right, threatens the UN's ability to do its most basic work. And fourth, as you all know, right, this work is more necessary than it has ever been. As the UN is tasked with managing unprecedented levels of displacement, a growing number of intractable conflicts, and the humanitarian disasters that follow them, rising hunger and poverty in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, right, and the looming specters of climate change and public health crises. Those first 3 challenges are rooted in the P5's political dynamics, with consequences for everybody. But the fourth set of challenges arises from complex political dynamics across the world that can only be addressed by revitalizing multilateralism and ensuring strong leadership of multilateral systems, right? We only have a little time, and I want to make sure I keep my time, so I'm going to focus on this idea of the U.S. as a risk generator, right? So the U.S., but I'm happy to talk about any of these things in Q&A or with our panelists, right? So the U.S. under its current administration basically has a foreign policy that runs contrary to its past commitments and contrary to the UN's founding documents. We can think, therefore, about the resulting actions that the U.S. is going to take at the UN falling into 3 separate scenarios, I think. The first scenario is a scenario in which the U.S. steps away from its support of different multilateral instruments, and someone else, some other group of member states or some other member state, can fill the gaps left by either the US's funding or its expertise, right? We see this in arrangements like the Pandemic Treaty from earlier this year, in the sort of arrangements around financing for development, around the Paris Agreement. These are practically hard situations, but they're politically comparatively straightforward. They require some group of other states to produce the funding that the U.S. might have otherwise provided, and to ensure good stewardship, right? The second set of scenarios is one in which the U.S. pivots to vote alongside conservative autocracies. Now, this is a situation that we've already seen in less extreme versions under the George W. Bush presidency, right? So it's a set of scenarios that is something member states and administrators at the UN already have some experience with, right? And that other member states might welcome as they try and build their own political coalitions and support. The third set of scenarios, I think, is the most politically challenging, right? This set of scenarios is a set of scenarios in which the U.S. actively tries to destabilize existing arrangements in some realms of UN activity, such as the Sustainable Development Goals or senior leadership appointments, by either sort of tactically restricting or withholding funding and attempting to dismantle programs, initiatives, and existing consensuses. Or even, as we saw just last week, right, with intimidation tactics. So we saw last week, for instance, the U.S. Secretary of State step in to actively derail the International Maritime Organization's agreements on emission taxes for shipping firms, right? These are more difficult strategic situations because other member states and the UN leadership need to counter the US's destructive efforts while also filling the funding and strategic gaps that the US leaves in its wake. And one way for us to think about the selection of the Secretary General in this situation is to try and make sure the selection process stays in the first or second set of scenarios and not the third, right? So it is either a selection process that is of little interest to the United States, or where the United States finds its interests aligned with other member states, rather than a scenario in which the US views this as an opportunity to help break the institution, right? In this context, the candidates who are probably most likely to survive a vetting process are low-profile candidates who know how to speak persuasively about the UN's core values to many different kinds of constituencies. And the vetting process that's most likely to produce a successful candidate is going to be one where transparency is balanced against drawing too much attention from right-wing misinformation media machines. Now, the last two selection cycles have been importantly focused on more transparency and more structure for the selection process. And the challenge here is making sure that added transparency doesn't attract the information of a media ecosystem that has otherwise no interest in the UN, right? But that might help swing the US towards a situation where they're actively trying to choose a candidate that will torpedo the UN's founding goals, right? This might be the kind of thing where balancing big public sessions with things like Chatham House rule meetings, so a wide variety of constituencies and stakeholders can quietly sound out the nominees' ideas, are an important way to proceed. Now, in line with proposals from ACT and the ad hoc working group on the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly, member states might find it useful to build coalitions to nominate candidates together, right? Or to agree to present multiple candidates to the General Assembly for their consideration. And member states who are interested in a woman Secretary General, and especially a feminist Secretary General, may unfortunately find that it's actually in their best interests not to emphasize her feminist credentials, or even that she's a woman in the process, right? So while the historical moment we're in demands a transformative and creative and brave Secretary General, the political environment is likely to select for candidates who do not present themselves this way, right? But as I said, I think there are opportunities to land on a candidate who could potentially do both. And we heard about Utahns earlier, but I think there's also a lesson and an instructive historical example in Javier Pérez de Cuellar. His selection in 1982 by a deeply divided UN Security Council was at a particularly volatile moment in the Cold War. He was a career diplomat who was described in his own obituary as everyone's last choice for Secretary General, right? He won the office after a 6-week deadlock at the Security Council at the end of the 16th ballot. He didn't campaign for the office. In fact, he was at home in Peru waiting to be reassigned to Brazil, right? But he was ultimately what one delegate described as the least objectionable candidate. And in his 2 terms, he went on to help end the war between Iran and Iraq, to help broker the ends of conflicts in Cambodia, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador, to oversee Namibia's independence, and to secure the withdrawal of Soviet forces alongside others from Afghanistan. And while the way he was selected belongs to a different era, right, a closed sort of back room of an elite pact, his demonstrated fidelity to UN values before his selection, right, his willingness to engage in high-stakes diplomacy personally, and especially the consensus nature of his candidacy probably underwrote most of his success. He probably was able to establish good diplomatic bona fides because people weren't terribly concerned about him, right? And today, finding a candidate who can survive the selection process and do transformative work may require building the kinds of coalitions to nominate candidates who can do both these things, right? And to balance mindfulness about their values with what kinds of transparency are effective to try and get them past the finish line. It may mean that the selection process runs a little longer, right? And that some big decision points or opportunities for candidates overlap with big meetings at UN headquarters, giving people the opportunity to quietly sound out values in person, right? It might mean extending the selection process to include widely broadcast public meetings with civil society, member states, and UN staff, as well as rounds of closed-door meetings, right, with many stakeholders, not just the P5. In a highly polarized time, when the UN is an active target for its key funders, there is a real challenge in balancing this meaningful vetting, which every candidate should face, with the imperative for transparency that should characterize the UN's work and that enhances its legitimacy, right? Now, since the brief was published, there is some evidence that the US is more interested in actively disrupting the selection process for the Secretary General than they are in simply letting it happen without very much interest, making this a slightly more strategically complicated situation. The arrival of Mike Waltz as the US ambassador to the UN in September gave the mission more direction. At his confirmation hearing, he indicated that he and other members of his party would be paying close attention to the selection process. But it is clear that he is also primarily acting on instructions from Washington, D.C. directly. They are taking a direct interest in the process. The clearest evidence we saw of this was on October 24th, when the Deputy Chief of Mission, Dorothy Shea, at a Security Council said that the U.S. would consider only merit-based characteristics for the candidate of Secretary General. Now, in the language of MAGA foreign policy, essentially this means that they will not consider gender or geographic determinations when they're considering candidates. Where previously, because of regional rotation and because of efforts to put a woman in the position, the most likely pool of candidates was a Latin American woman, right? Today, we have to consider the race to be comparatively more open, right? So I will leave it there.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Anjali. That leaves us a bit in a quandary, I have to say. We're not quite clear where it's going, but lots of scenarios are open. And thank you so much for clarifying to us, in a sense, which avenues we may be able to expect. All right, now we have two very distinguished commentators. Robert, do you want to go first and share with us your thoughts on Anjali's brief and what she's just outlined?
Sure. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. And Anjali, thank you for excellent presentation and a really gripping kind of analysis. This narrative about the best candidate may be the one that's, the least high profile. It makes me smile that we might have this sort of competition where each candidate proves that they're the most boring option, and there's a sort of race to the bottom to see who wins that race. But I think perhaps three comments to complement Anjali's very, very good presentation. First, and she did mention this is not the first crisis of the UN. I absolutely accept that we are in the middle of a major crisis, but I think all of our previous generations have also lived through various crises, and that kind of reassures me. I've read, or actually I'm halfway through the U Thant biography, but I was reading the Kofi Annan book by Traubman recently, and each one of those is a story of a Secretary General that comes in faced with tremendous international crises and a huge amount of criticism of the UN, and the critiques are there, and we are in a different place. The variables are new for sure, and Anjali talked about those and the US's shift in position, but it's not the first crisis, and these processes, even in the middle of the Cold War, have eventually kind of eventuated, often, as we've heard, with fairly low-key candidates that are least threatening, but grow into the role of Pérez de Cuellar, Kofi Annan, and U Thant. And so we want to hope that, indeed, this time round, a woman who will grow into the role, as everyone has done over the years. So that, I think, it's important to remember. This is not the first time we find ourselves in this situation. I want to hope that then we find our way through. The second is to recognize how hard it is for an incoming Secretary General to balance the conversations around the internal workings of the UN versus the crises outside. And this is very difficult. I think most people want the UN to focus on peace. They want to fix Gaza. They want to see the UN fix Ukraine and Sudan. And yet, most of the UN at the moment, most of the oxygen in New York and even in Geneva is very inward-looking, right? About cuts and about budget and about unfunded mandates. And I think this is hugely difficult to find a balance. Very risky, and very risky if we get it wrong. And let me add another kind of contradiction in that, which is that I think we need a Secretary General that A, is very outward-looking, and B, is a very good communicator, which typically doesn't come with the low-key, right, boring candidate, if you see what I mean. But we definitely, desperately need to make sure that we have an SG for the next round as well. And I think this SG's done a very good job on this, but it's got to keep going. More than ever now, we have to make the case for multilateralism, not just with parliamentarians and Congress people, but actually with the general public. And that requires a kind of, not just a communications machine, but an individual who is a powerful advocate. So I think finding that balance between the Secretary and the General is going to be one of the tremendous challenges for whoever comes in. And when we look at the different candidates, we've got to ask ourselves how they're going to balance those things. But they're also going to join a moving train. A lot is already happening on reform. I think it's very unusual for an outgoing Secretary General, and if we can call him that, he's got another year to go, but to roll out a host of reforms in his last 14 months in office is not typical. And these are not typical times. I don't think he chose that by any means, but he was forced by circumstances to push this reform process forward rather than letting his successor kind of take it up. So his successor will inherit this moving train of reforms, and she will shape it, hopefully in the way she wishes, but she will also have to embrace some of these changes and not get too swallowed up by the internal machinations, if you will, of reform. Which brings me to my third and last kind of comment, which is about the fact that I think it's important to remind ourselves that this is not just about one individual. Obviously, the UN's a team and so forth, but I want to talk in particular about the Deputy Secretary General. Because what has shifted with this Secretary General, if you look back at the previous Deputy Secretary Generals, and there haven't, was instituted in, I think, 97 by Kofi Annan, introducing a Deputy Secretary General. Someone can correct me if I've got the year wrong, but each Deputy Secretary General has played a quite ad hoc role, kind of complementing the SG, picking up the bits that the SG wasn't interested in. And many of them were perhaps aspiring SGs that took the second job and have done a tremendous kind of role. But what has happened with this Secretary General is that he lifted the leadership of the development system to the Deputy Secretary General. And not just in name, but built all of these structures around the function of the Deputy Secretary General as the lead for development, as the lead on the Sustainable Development Goals. That's a $20 billion part of the UN system. And now those structures have grown around her. We can't really turn back. So I'm quite preoccupied about not only the Secretary General election process, but what's going to happen with the Deputy Secretary General. And if we have the wrong, if you will, the wrong profile in that role as well, it's a little catastrophic for all of the work that has happened over the last 8 years in sort of major structural reform. So let me just throw that in as an extra variable to worry about. Back to you, Nico. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting, actually. I think kind of the Deputy Secretary General is often get kind of sort of lost in kind of when we talk about the kind of Secretary General, right, and who kind of gathers all the attention, and then kind of the not quite lower, but relatively lower ranks are not really in view, but they are often equally as important for the running of the UN and in part also for the visibility of the system. Thank you so much. Laurel, your turn.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. Thanks to Anjali for the excellent study, and Robert for the comments, and thanks for the opportunity to have a conversation that is in part as well about looking at the UN and what we need from the UN in the future that's about values and vision and not just about the economic and financial constraints that we have at the moment. They're an essential part of the conversation, but it's important that we can talk about more. And I'll start by saying that what I would like to see in a Secretary General is someone who can really deliver on peace and justice and from a place of values and vision. But what I'm grappling with and what I've been grappling with since I have been digesting Anjali's excellent report is what's the difference between what I would like to see in the Secretary General and what I think is possible can make it through the selection process, and how we navigate this. And whilst I'd love to see a Secretary General appointment process which really ignites the public imagination and builds trust and helps address the legitimacy crisis, the trust deficit that we're seeing with the UN at the moment, and provides hope, I'm trying to separate that from my stronger belief that actually what we really need is someone who can do that in office. So it's much more about what can they actually deliver when they're in office, what can they do and say when they hold that, than what they can do and say in the next year in the selection process. And that lends itself to this. We need someone who's a stealth visionary, who can present as competent and capable, but who has that strand within them that can be drawn out once they're in position. And that means working through this process as really as a principled pragmatist. How do we get the things that we think we need? And this has been raised through what others have said, but there is clearly a tension identified in the report and in what's been said about the value of a much more transparent process, and the risks that the stronger a candidate looks on some key issues, the less likely they are to make it through the selection process. And also this risk that greater transparency could potentially backfire and further undermine the sense of legitimacy and trust. If there really is going to be a very small number of people involved in the actual decision of who can pass through, it doesn't serve legitimacy and trust for more people to be more aware of that. And so I've been trying to think about how do we address that and think about legitimacy and think about legitimacy of the institution and of the Secretary General coming in this fraught environment, and also how to come at this from a human rights perspective, when knowing that what we're not likely to see is someone stand up and put that front and centre. And this really, for me, comes back to, again, the doing rather than the saying. And I was thinking about what would feed a human rights-based approach to this. And a core element of a human rights-based approach is responsibility to rights holders, responsibility to the wider public, as has been said by others, and building out from Anjali's really interesting suggestion about the role of low-profile public briefings. I'd encourage coupling that with national dialogues or consultations, not with the candidates, but on the principles and priorities of the SG. So states that value the UN need to stand up for it visibly at the moment, both in global conversation and in national discourse. As you're saying, it's not just what do they do and say in New York and Geneva, but how are they telling their publics what the importance of this is and what it means in their lives. So those states that understand their responsibility to be visibly invested in the UN could be holding consultations and discussions to hear from their publics their views on the criteria that they have for a Secretary General, the issues they would like to see promoted, the questions they would like to have asked, and at minimum to do that with their civil society organisations, but ideally with a really broad range of constituencies. And that's with a view to informing that state's approach to their positions in the selection process, and potentially to bringing that into those low-profile briefings or the Chatham House conversations. This would intentionally not be about the candidate, but about what people want from someone in this office, and would need to be framed carefully to manage expectations. We're not talking about giving the wider global public a decisive role in the process, but giving them space to be informed about it and to inform it. And my assumption is that key messages that could be drawn from broad consultations and conversations would not be particularly radical or surprising, that they're likely to centre peace, they're likely to centre human security and dignity, how people feel that their standard of living is, all of which are the core business of the UN. This could serve not just the selection, but also how the incoming SG holds office, with the possibility of drawing on the priorities from these consultations in framing their approaches, which, as I say, are unlikely to surface anything hugely significant that's not already known, but could be used, but would allow the SG to show an openness to engaging with the wider public. It could inform the messaging needed at specific country levels and globally in dealing with the trust deficit and the legitimacy problem. And it would allow states who are supportive of multilateralism to really demonstrate that by engaging with their publics and then engaging vocally with that in the spaces where the conversations happen around the SG. And finally, it could allow the elements of this process not be business as usual, but in a positive way, to try and build on the transparency, but in a way that doesn't undermine the legitimacy doesn't further undermine the legitimacy of the process, and that suggests that some of the conversation and noise around this is about what individual people, what publics want, rather than just the kind of the highest levels of geopolitics.
Thank you so much. I thought it was very heartening to hear this push for kind of an involvement of publics also kind of at the national level, which of course is much closer to people's lives really than discussions in Geneva or New York or kind of wherever they may be had, right, where hardly anybody knows about. At the same time, I was kind of particularly struck by the tension between what you said before, the need to show in office what someone might be, which suggests really, kind of as Robert suggested, we might have a race for being the most boring candidate. But it might also suggest that really kind of what you need is a more Trojan horse, right? Someone who is kind of who's not seen yet as who they might be, and then later kind of develop. But that, of course, somehow goes very much against the interest of transparency. Kind of you would want to bring out in the open what candidates are about. So we really kind of we have a tension there, I think, kind of in the process that is particularly pronounced this time. Anjali, do you want to respond briefly to some of the comments?
Yeah, so thank you both for these very thoughtful comments. The charge I was given in the brief was to consider the selection process and not to expound on what I personally would think was the ideal candidate. But I am heartened to hear both of you reflect on things that I also think are quite important, right? In particular, this idea that the next Secretary General should be a dynamic, effective public communicator. Right? As both of you noted, the cause of multilateralism, the values embedded in the UN Charter, the sort of underpinning architecture of human rights and development, those are not just the thing of elite rooms. Those are not just the thing of parliamentarians, right? That requires making the case to the public. So it requires a Secretary General, I think, who is good at public communication in many kinds of media, right? Who is good at new media, who is good at trying to make a pitch to people about why this matters in a world where they have busy and difficult lives, right? Or about what the value of having these systems in place is for people, right? So in that front, I think that's quite important. But as you know, right, if we're actually in the kind of scenario where everyone is trying to be the dullest person in the room, it might be hard to sort of suss that out. The second point I wanted to highlight is that this idea that one way to do this would be to sort of consider national consultations that satisfy the cause of transparency without being disruptive, right? I think is quite a brilliant one in line with this idea that you should have good public-facing communication about what multilateralism is, what the point of the UN system is, what kinds of parts of like a person's daily life they underwrite that are sort of taken for granted, right? When we think, for instance, about, why do people have a reflexive understanding that invading another country is wrong, right? Well, that's because the UN Charter is a pact to outlaw aggressive warfare that we have so deeply normalized that we don't think about it anymore, except that is also under threat, right? So having someone who can make the public case for why that matters is critical. And I also do want to note, I do think it's very important, as you noted also, Robert, to say that this is not the first crisis the UN has faced. And this is not the first sort of massive disruption of potential arrangements that the UN has faced. And we should be heartened by the fact that it's come through the previous ones. Yeah.
Thanks. Let me maybe kind of follow on with a quick question that has to do with the procedure, right? You emphasized very much, and this has been sort of the subtext, of course, of what we've been saying, that the procedure for selecting the Secretary General has changed and has become more transparent since 2015, when the General Assembly kind of first put in place this more transparent process. And that has been somewhat strengthened over the years, and especially kind of maybe with this year's resolution of the General Assembly. That clearly kind of pushes us towards a public process. At the same time, much of what we've heard suggested that somehow the real decisions will be taken somewhat less publicly. And you also mentioned, well, there may be kind of some disappointment as a result, right? In a sense, you build promises kind of through a process that involves publics at different levels. And then somehow it seems kind of the decision-making goes somewhere else. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you likely see this process unfolding. What role is the public process really going to play? Or is it potentially likely that kind of we'll have late entering candidates who are actually more likely to be successful because they haven't been scrutinized, because they haven't had to show their faces before, and therefore kind of haven't had the degree of challenge potentially and visibility that could have attracted opposition from some that may not like what they have to say. So what are the procedural stakes here? I don't know, who wants to go first, Anjali?
Well, I'd say what we're actually seeing is the fundamental tension of the UN itself, right? In theory, there should be a sort of broad-based, transparent, globally open process to select the sort of chief diplomat. And the person who's charged with overseeing what is inherently a global body. But the way the UN is structured is to give an outsized voice to its 5 permanent members, right? And at the end of the day, that fundamental contradiction, you can't really, I think, procedure your way out of it, right? And one of the dangers, I think, you highlighted quite well, is that at the end of the day, this is an elite pact. 5 people have to agree, 5 states have to agree on who the candidate will be in order for them to proceed to the next stage. And because of that, all the transparency in the world isn't necessarily going to move a candidate. That is not great, right? That is delegitimizing. It means at the end of the day, we don't have a broad base of appeal, support, of sort of information that necessarily feeds into the process. And I don't think there are procedural fixes around that, right? There is just the willingness of those 5 states to engage in good faith, transparent debates, as opposed to any kind of like real administrative, like fiddling around the edges.
Maybe just one thing I've been reading, Angelique can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not in the rules of procedure, but that the GA has asked, hopefully, to receive at least a couple of candidates from the Security Council. So it's not just one name showing up for vote. I mean, that's not exactly kind of throwing the doors open, but at least a kind of recognition that this is that the General Assembly, with all of its 193 membership, of also a critical part of the process. It's a small piece, but it's would be a move in the right direction. I think that's something to watch, whether the Council is willing to do that or not.
Maybe just briefly as well, I think, and that's building on Robert's point there about like it, how do we build it out from being the 5 states? And I think there's a real risk that the rest of the membership sort of throws their hands up and says this isn't relevant for us. And I think we need to responsibilize the rest of the membership to have an active role in this, to say that they are relevant, to keep showing that they're relevant, and to create the spaces where they are saying what their expectations are, to not pretending that there's a procedural way around this, not pretending that there isn't an outsized power held by a few, but that it's not, that they haven't just walked away from it and left that they're like, what's the enabling environment that other states can create for a meaningful process that brings forward the right candidate in this context?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really important point, right? The question is to what extent other countries can mobilize, right? Because in the Security Council at least, you need 9 votes for the recommendation, and you need a majority in the General Assembly. So far, there haven't been really votes, except for once, really, about this. But clearly, there's a question to what extent other countries can signal their rejection of a candidate, potentially also preferences for a particular candidate. But that might be more tricky. But at least sort of signaling to the P5 what they would not want to go along with, right? Do you see there's a possibility of this happening, or is the General Assembly just too divided for that?
I think there's a lot of innovation happening in this process and at the General Assembly level to try and counter this fundamental tension in the UN system, right? And so, I think a lot of diplomats are working on incredibly creative solutions to the problems of Security Council gridlock and the outsized voice that the Security Council has on a number of these questions, including the selection of the Secretary General. But I think particularly on this point, there is real contention on some of the core procedural provisions about how to select the Secretary General, ranging from, in this particular race, what region should be represented, all the way through to this question of whether or not the General Assembly should be voting on multiple candidates, right? And I don't mean to suggest that only those 5 states matter in the UN system, but of course, as we all know, the other member states don't speak with one voice. And because they all have their own politics and different projects, right, what we sometimes see is that the overweighting of the P5 in the Charter easily defeats a divided set of priorities among other member states, right? And so, as you were both noting, right, making sure other interested states, particularly those who see their foreign policies tied up in the cause of multilateralism, in the cause of human rights, in the cause of freedom of development, right? To the extent that they don't abandon the process, right, we will see, I think, better outcomes.
All right. Maybe this is a good moment to kind of open the floor. I already see some hands up, and I think I'm going to take a few questions together in order to sort of then move us forward, and then we see how much time we really have. We should finish at 1:45. All right. So I've seen kind of your hand, and Syed. Yeah, please go first.
Thank you very much for the organizers as well as the speakers for this timely debate, I think, because this is the time to discuss these things. A comment was made that what you need is a strong leader, a brave person. I was asking myself which of the previous Secretary General was not a brave person or not a strong leader. I would like to escalate it further, and that's more my personal opinion. I think what is required of a Secretary General for the United Nations is somebody who's a disruptor, the one who shakes up the system, not really the cosmetic changes and those type of, somebody who's able to take the risk. I have not seen any Secretary General taking the risk. If the charter was being flouted by some countries, didn't the Secretary General have a choice to put in his resignation to say, well, look, this is not something which appeals with me, I will like to leave. So I would say, I think this is like you hear of MAGA, somebody who makes Munga, make United Nations great again, that type of a thing. And I have a second comment also, which I think is also important. I have a feeling somebody who comes from outside the system is likely to be more objective. I don't know the biography of all the previous Secretary Generals, but if there is somebody who comes from the UN system, is likely to be more protective of whether it is financing, whether it is restructuring, reforms. Most of the reforms I have seen is more of cosmetic things, not really the reforms. Somebody who's able to shake up the agency, who's able to wind up the agencies which are no more required. Just as an example, UNAIDS is under pressure now to wind up because of financing, whereas it should have folded up 15 years back when there was evidence already coming up that HIV was going down. So those are the kind of things. And also on the gender, I think United Nations does not have to have a female as the choice. If there is a female, is fine. To demonstrate its sensitivity to gender, I think it has enough credibility to justify that it is taken care of both the males or females, and to put a Secretary General and definitely as a female may not be something which is required to confirm that. Thank you.
Thank you. That is going to stir controversy. Thank you very much. Could I ask speakers to just introduce yourself briefly? Sorry, I didn't mention that before. Yeah, no, it's kind of the lady in the a bit further in the back. Well, okay. Well, you're going to get there.
Thank you very much. I am Manuela Tortore, former PhD student here at the Graduate Institute, retired from the UN Secretariat, UNCTAD more concretely. I would like to propose an amendment to the title of this conversation. Who can lead the disarrayed world? I don't think a Secretary General can pretend to lead a disarrayed or not disarrayed world anyway. I would rather say who can lead a disarrayed organization in a disarrayed world. Because this is the challenge, and because I think at the end of the day, the ball is in the camp of member state, much more than in the camp of the Secretary General, whoever will be elected. So I think we should focus first on who has the responsibility of managing the organization in the political sense, not to manage your daily tasks. And that was a little bit missing, I think, in your comments, which were fine, but didn't reach that level. And my second comment regards Robert Piper's note on the development system. Of course, I come from that camp, so obviously I'm sensitive to that. And I think it is a very, very important question, not only related to the Deputy Secretary General per se, but rather the function of the UN development system and what it delivers, which is probably neglected, not well known, and certainly, in my view, at least as important as human rights, peace and security, environment, and many other topics, because it is the roots of peace and security. So I would like also to hear more about, in this debate and other debates, more about the development role, which is also, by the way, very important for Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady 2 rows behind her. Yes.
Thank you so much.
No, the lady behind you. Now, I passed her over already. Now
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Velasco. I am from Peru, so I'm glad that you mentioned Javier Pérez de Cuellar. I'm the student of international relations here, and I just want to know a little bit more about these kind of informal rules that there are in the selection process. As Anjali mentioned, maybe this new election is going to be more broad, but like before it was geographically based, and I want to know if there are like some other kind of informal rules that exist in the selection process, and how easy is really to change those rules, because like I'm just wondering how easy it would be like now to say, okay, we're not going to respect the costume or the rule of like the geographical how we selected before. Like I just want to understand those dynamics. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just pass the microphone to the gentleman in front of you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Maybe we bring it back to the panel.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Adam. I used to be here in this auditorium because I am one of the alumni of the Graduate Institute of Geneva. In fact, she touched the border of my concern, because my job this time is, and I was thinking of having another conversation on this issue, because now when we talk about the Secretary General, we're talking about someone who leads as a secretary, not as the leader of the world. This is the important thing. So my thinking when I came here was to transform, and my job at the time is how could we transform the Secretary General, the UN as an institution, to a leading institution, not only having the role of secretary, because the Secretary General at the time, here now and throughout the history, has only the role, he does not have the executive role. So we couldn't simply say he's leading the world, he's leading the secretary, he's leading the institution. That was my point, and I'm working on that one. How could we transform the UN to a leading institution rather than a secretarial role? That was important for the research, and that's maybe how we could come up with someone who leads the role of maybe negotiations, everything that he has in his power. Now, as we stand today, and as a former diplomat, I used to be the charge d'affaires of Eritrea here for 7 years in Geneva. So I know what is the system looks like, how we do the negotiations, how we design resolutions. So within that knowledge, I am working on how we could transform this system to an executive kind of system, so that we can have a reliable voice of all of us. We technically are talking about the P5, as the professor said. We're just talking about the P5 because finally it melts down to this P5 members. Whether we are on General Assembly or another, it will be finally the decisive power is within the P5 members. So that is exactly what was my purpose to come here. So anyway, that would be an important point to look at when we try to figure out who could be. But then who could be should be, I think, a political will of this P5, whatever they are. 9, yes, I know they need some more 4-member, non-members, but finally the decisive power lies on those P5. So thank you so much. That's important for all of us, and it was very nice hearing from you, a thoughtful presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I hope we have time for another round, but I want to bring it back to the panel. We have the big question of how to manga kind of in front of us, but lots of other kind of really important questions. Who would like to go first? Anjali.
I'll just go down in order very quickly. Is what the UN needs a disruptor? I think look at what disruptors have wrought, right? We are currently living in a world characterized by the supremacy of disruptors in this political moment. It has not gone well for us, at least in my country, right? That said, right, the question of whether or not someone from outside the system might be more likely to lead it effectively is, I think, an important one, and it goes to your very important question about the Secretary General as an administrator, right? Because there is this chief tension that both of you raised about the Secretary General as chief administrator versus chief diplomat. And this brief and this talk and the selection process, it does not, the idea that the person should be able to lead the United Nations as an administrator internally is sort of the baseline qualification for the position. And I actually think it's probably the thing they are most likely to hit well, because we can imagine a world in which the Permanent Five can agree on someone who is a quiet caretaker administrator pretty straightforwardly, right? I would say the political profiles of these 5 states mean that they are unlikely to leave it there. And that's why we start to think about the sort of other political valences of the job. But I think, especially as you both noted, this is the key function of the job, and therefore we would want the person to be good at that. I think we should probably worry the least that they'll choose someone who isn't good at that, because actually, as you noted, right, they're not inclined that way in the sense that if they're going to agree on someone, it's going to be someone who's good at this job. Where they will disagree is someone who's going to try and upend the system, right? And so we see those 2 different poles there. On the question of whether or not the Secretary General needs to be a woman, this division between whether it's sufficient for the Secretary General to be a feminist and not a woman is actually the same debate that produced Antonio Guterres as the Secretary General. He then made an effort to appoint a significant number of women to leadership under him. I would say at this point, we don't know how the selection process will turn out. There is a value to representativeness, right? If you have 80 straight years of men in a position, it's not accidental, right? That tells us something about the dynamics of the selection process that are not just the best person is getting the position, right? By chance alone, we wouldn't arrive at that. And so that's why we think about this as being the kind of process where we think about why we've only had men Secretary Generals in the past. And finally, on this question of informal versus formal rules and selections, the norm of regional rotation is informal. It is just a sort of informal norm. It is comparatively easy to change by agreement. And one of the big debates right now is whether or not Eastern Europe or Latin America is due for the seat, because Antonio Guterres was selected at a time when Eastern Europe felt, the regional grouping felt that it was its turn for Secretary General. And so one of the debates right now is whether or not Eastern Europe should get a shot at the seat instead of Latin America as well. Yeah.
Is Eastern Europe a region per se? I mean, they never have had a turn, have they? No, I mean, there's never been a kind of Eastern European candidate. So the question is that the problem that needs to be fixed? And if that needs to be fixed, then for sure it must be their turn. But I guess that's in the background. I think one of the big questions is whether we think the UN is going to go through a massive transformation over the coming few years, forced by circumstances, good or bad, or whether or not ultimately that is too risky and we're going to have to kind of incrementally. We can all agree the UN needs to be fixed, right? I'm sure if we had a show of hands in this room, even the die-hard UN people like me in this room would have to put their hand up and say, yeah, it needs some major changes. The question is, do we do the open heart surgery, put the thing on the slab, or do we look a bit more incrementally? And I think that's a question we all can debate. It's worth a debate, but that will affect then who you want as the chief surgeon, if you will, depending on So I think looking back at insiders and outsiders, I think it's a tricky one because I see people like Kofi Annan and this Secretary General, because they came from inside, in effect. I mean, Guterres was up the road at UNHCR. They know a lot about where the bodies are buried, and if you will, in some cases too much. And so they were able to make some big structural changes that someone that's coming in from the outside never quite gets deep enough, because they never, they just don't have that sort of 10-year, 20-year kind of perspective. So, Guterres is now in his 20th year, going into his 20th year at the UN. He knows the UN really well. I mean, he's done other things as well, but you have to recognize that he really does know where the bodies are buried. So I think this is a kind of debate we need to have as well, and look at previous Secretary Generals. They've all been familiar with the UN to different degrees, but some of them really have been deep insiders, like Kofi Annan, and I would say Antonio Guterres, and just ask ourselves what's the profile at the moment. One of the reform ideas, which I think is the most powerful one, speaking of disruption and taking risk, is that the Secretary General should have a one term and not two. And I think that's an idea that unfortunately hasn't really been given a lot of oxygen. But the proposal that came, I don't know where it started, was that there should be a one 7-year term for an SG, and that would indeed create the conditions for a bit more courage or risk-taking, because you don't have to pander for your re-election. And I think that's an idea that probably deserves a lot more attention than it's been given, but so far, unfortunately, not much appetite. I think just to finish from my side is on the development piece. I mean, I'm obviously very attached to that as well, and I think Geneva, for me, is also this incredible concentration of specialized agencies, as well as the norm setting and the humanitarian kind of center of gravity. But I also am very kind of conscious that these specialized agencies of the UN, like the ITUs and the WMOs and the UNCTADs and so forth, are really where the UN has its policy depth. And they are the parts of the UN that came in a way before everything else. We've built our kind of collective security model around this fundamental cooperation around development issues and trade and so forth. So I think now is also the time for those issues to come much more to the surface. I think there are, in Washington, these are at least people that understand the importance of oiling commerce, of keeping planes in the air, of making sure that data on storms and diseases is being shared and put in the right hands at the right time. So I do think right now is also a very important time for those specialized parts of the UN system to really be brought forward in the narrative to really bolster multilateralism. I think that's a language that a lot of people will understand today and need to hear.
Very little to add other than on the disruptors of there are things that we can want to have happen, and then there's the reality and the context that we're in. And I think you put that very well. We have disruptors all over the place who are not delivering for people. So the question is, what will deliver best for people, for all of us? And I'm not convinced that is what we need now, although there is a sense that we're not in a business as usual situation, so we don't need a business as usual leadership, but it's what that looks like and what space they have, and that links into your point, Robert, on the kind of looking at the term reform, because somebody can come in however they get through this selection process, but how bold will they be initially if they're trying to get through another process in another 5 years? So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Thanks a lot. We have a little time, I think, for a second round, so I'll take 3, maximum 4 questions, and I'll ask everybody to be very brief in your questions. Yeah.
Sorry, I have mine of the One Goal Initiative for Governance. Laura, good to see you again. I'd like to say one thing to you and one thing to you. Pragmatism, I think, also requires asking oneself the question, is what we think that we need really what we need? And taking the answer all the way. Really, really inquiring. Now, to you, there used to be something called separation of powers. Now, the UN has a normative role. If it would also have officially an executive role, we might need to ask ourselves some institutional design questions. On the other hand, I'm not sure it doesn't actually already have some executive de facto. Thank you.
Sayed Masha, LLM candidate here at the Institute. So, I mean, I was listening to the opening speech, and there was a mention of the Secretary General's Buddhist background and his values. Then it made me think about religion, and how religion plays a very strong role in many of the Secretary Generals and their roles, and they have cited that, Gutierrez himself as well. Ironically, then I was looking at the Islamic world has not been represented by the Secretary General position in its history. And yet, the UN is very interested in the Islamic world. More than 50% of its operational budget, physical offices, the activities are focused on that. I mean, you're from working in displacement, you already know 60% of the world's displacement population is there. 8 out of the 11 UN operations in the Muslim world. So I began to ask myself this question, is that why does that not play an important role and factor? Is that maybe because of the lack of coordination between those countries, and how that will possibly be? And I know we have a Deputy Secretary General currently, Madam Amina, but I think she's due to retire right after the Secretary General anyways. So that's one question. And one question, an institute-based question, so I'll take the liberty for that. We have a candidate who's put his name in the hat, who's associated with the Institute, Rafael Grossi. And this institute, historically, before I came here, just briefly, was designed as the institute to train people for the multilateral system. So perhaps maybe the moderator, my dear professor, you can take this question about, in that context, is that this institute was designed for that purpose, actually. It was to create people to go into the League of Nations initially, and now the United Nations, and it's very intimately connected to the UN. So how does that weigh in that? Not necessarily precise, but you get the question.
Thank you. I had another hand up. Yeah, Gianluca. And then
Thank you. Gianluca Burci, Graduate Institute. Excellent discussion. and fascinating about the process, the emphasis on the process. To me, the process is a proxy for the tension which is implicit in the UN system between a political process, because the electing the Secretary General, like an executive head, in the end is a political process, with all the horse trading among states that inevitably happen. The second is the idea of democratizing, opening up. This is our Secretary General. We need somehow to be involved. And the third is about the quality of the individual. That also the US now is preaching it, but to me is already a proxy for a white man as the next Secretary General. So I worked many years in WHO, which has gone to an extreme in the sense of democratizing, codifying the process. But maybe I become too cynical after 30 years, and I wonder whether it makes a difference in the end. Because yes, it's our Secretary General, but it is a political process, in the UN in particular with the P5. To me, and it's a comment, what will make a tremendous difference is what Mr. Piper said. It is the Security Council proposed more than one candidate. Then the General Assembly would be the deciding factor. And then the politics cannot be played among 15 countries. It has to be played among 193. The politics would change radically. So that's a thought to put there, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. The last question is up there on the right. Thanks. I'll make you run.
Thank you. My name is Augusto Cabrera. I'm the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Peru here. So also I wanted to thank you for the mentioning of my colleague Ambassador Perez de Cuellar, together with Margarita, who spoke previously. And I wanted to point out that his low profile was not a matter of shyness, but was rather a matter of prudence. And a very smart and fine reading of the multilateral scene back then in the 80s. And he was clever enough to, though he was one of the least popular candidates at the beginning, in the re-election, all the P5 asked him together to be the candidate, to run for re-election with the consensus of the P5 members. So, but it was a different world. It was a different multilateralism. Now challenges are quite different. And also wanted to make a mention to the regional aspirations. Because here, I mean, we know that there's been 3 European SGs, 2 from Asia, 2 from Africa, 1 from Latin America. So, but now I see that this aspiration doesn't only come to the regional basis, which is not a strict rule in the charter, but rather like this desire. But also now it comes to the sub-regions, and also merged to religious groups, groups that are major religious groups. So I wanted to ask you, how do you think this is going to play in the election of the new Secretary General in this context? I mean, the regionalisms and the sub-regionalisms, if I can say. And one question, and the other one is, do you think that being like too, I wouldn't say outspoken, but too aspirational, too ambitious is the key to play now in this context, in terms of the new mandate of the Secretary General? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, a whole host of questions open to you. Anjali?
So, again, I'll just go in order. So first, I just want to go back for a second and highlight the point that you made about, the sort of technical parts of the UN are where the policy depth of the UN system actually is. And when we talk about making a public case for the UN, for a Secretary General who can make the public case to the UN, people don't know that, right? people don't know that this is what the work of the UN actually is. They don't know that it is what helps keep planes in the sky and get your mail there on time and coordinate trade, right? And because of that, what we see is declining support for the UN worldwide in ways that collectively undermine the sort of globalized world that we've built, right? And so when we talk about making the case, it's also making the case for why this technical policy depth matters and why it is actually not replaceable, right? It's not as though it's the kind of thing that you can bring home and place under a national capital, right? So I just wanted to highlight that. On the question of the representation of the Muslim world, right, and of the Middle East, to the best of my knowledge, there has been one Muslim Secretary General, Boutros Ghali, right? He's Coptic Christian. That's why I said I'm not sure. Okay, so he's Coptic Christian. On the regional representation, this is tricky because it also shows us why the same candidates for the Security Council keep being elected from the region, and it's because, again, this is my understanding, there are countries for whom it is not in their best interest to appear on the record as either voting for or against the U.S. under certain conditions, right? And there are countries for whom that is regionally and status enhancing. And so a country like Jordan is going to run to be on the Security Council a lot, and a country like Saudi Arabia is not, right? And that varies across region. It's not necessarily the case that doesn't happen in other regions, but the sort of particularly post-2000 world is one in which that has become a slightly more fraught proposition. I don't know when the region is due up next, because I think it's all up in the air at this point, right? These arrangements could go anyway. Does it make a difference if the process is more democratic? I think that's a fair point, right? I don't necessarily know that it's a cynical one for all the reasons that we were talking about, but I think, this move to either make for a single term for the Secretary General to present more than one candidate, those actually would be democratizing moves, right? On the questions about regions and sub-regions, I don't actually, again, I think we should not hold too tightly to the idea that those are going to matter at this particular moment, because I don't know what they're going to consider at the end of the day. I think there will probably, the Eastern Europe, there's no clear unifying theme for a candidate from the region. I think that's part of what happened in the last election process as well. But on your point about Pérez de Cuéllar being a sort of quiet diplomat, as you all know better than I do, diplomacy is not flashy, right? At the end of the day, the kind of effective diplomacy happens with intention and depth and a deep sense of what to say when to whom. And so when we were joking about a race to be the most dull, right? But actually it's a race to be the most measured, right? The person who knows what best to say to whom in what circumstance is likely to succeed not just at the process, but at the job. And finally, the question of, do you think that being too aspirational or too ambitious is the way to go on this process? I think that it would be a better world if someone could get up and talk about their most aspirational projects as Secretary General. And I think we have lived through periods where that would have been a possibility. I don't know that we're living through one right now, but I also want to say that I don't know that that is necessarily a reason not to do it, right? Making the case for what you think is the right way for things to be, I think it's an effective strategy at the end of the day. It doesn't necessarily mean it won't make it harder to get through what is fundamentally a political process and not necessarily a normative one.
Maybe just briefly on the kind of the representation which is coming through about both religious background, about gender, and about regions. I mean, that's part of the challenge is to find a candidate who can speak to and which member states can see something of themselves in, even if they're not having the same lived experience of them. And it's, that's the 1 for 8 billion idea, right? Like, they cannot represent in their lived experience everybody. So, but can they speak to those different interests well, is part of how to overcome some of that challenge. And then I really like this idea about the prudent low profile, and that is part of, if we're saying that what we need is someone who's a great communicator but who isn't flashy, that those things aren't necessarily in tension with each other. Actually, good communicators can connect, and they can listen, and they can read a room, and they can understand what's needed. And so the idea of when you hold back and when you don't is really critical, and is perhaps part of, as you're saying, how this tension can be navigated. And then just to add on, we were talking a little bit about hope before we started, and I think we need to continue to imagine the best case scenario, as well as being aware of what some of the potential worst case scenarios are, and continue to think about how we nurture the best case scenario at the same time we try to seek to prevent or mitigate worst case scenarios. So I hope there are ambitious people who aspirational people rather than ambitious people who will stand up. And there is a role for having candidates who aren't going to get it, but who are going to say something that we think needs to be said, because they might create the space for the conversation after the appointment.
That's an interesting thought too. Yes, about the role of the unsuccessful candidates in creating space. It's very. I guess it's the last comments too. 2 points. One, I think it's. The rotation informally is for Latin America and the Caribbean. I think if we disrupt that, it's going to cause a tremendous amount of stress on the system. But I don't think we need to confront those that say it's got to be merit-based. Fine, but let's make sure that we bring forward women from Latin America and the Caribbean. There's certainly plenty of qualified people that meet those criteria. And so I think rather than necessarily losing a tremendous amount of time in confronting that position, let's just get on with finding someone that does meet the merit standards, of course, who is a woman from Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think that's kind of the best way, rather than turning that into a kind of matter of principle. And the point will be to see whether the member states of the UN, the rest, if you will, stay with some solidarity to that principle or not. Because if they start to break ranks, then we're in trouble. But if, as long as 192 member states are willing to stick to that principle, then we should be okay. And I'd sort of focus on that rather than taking on these statements, which could well be just frankly playing to another audience. Remember, we have to remember that a lot of the stuff that's said could be for consumption, political consumption of a particular group and at home. And we kind of need to. We've heard that many times from many countries. When they're at the UN, we have to kind of look through what they've said, really for domestic consumption, and not apply it necessarily, not take it too deeply for the UN. The second thing I'd finish on is just this notion, which I started on, about the deputy and about the Deputy Secretary General, and about, I do worry sometimes about whether we do expect to load all these things on the Secretary General. I talked about the Deputy Secretary General as the lead on development, and I think it's a very, very important thing. But I also, if I had to pick, I would want a Secretary General that is a political genius rather than an administrative management genius, quite frankly. I think if I have to pick, I'd rather have that management genius a bit further down the food chain and have the political one at the top. And I think it's a shame if we do put too much of that administrative burden on the Secretary General. And the structure doesn't really lend itself very well to having that, what a modern corporation would have, of having a COO that's really doing the secretary while the CEO does the general. We don't really have the structure, and that's maybe one of the reforms that needs to come. But it could well be that the resistance to that reform comes from people who don't want a proactive Secretary General, that want a Secretary General that's very much kind of focused on running the back room and not being kind of taking the risks and being out front. So this is, I think, another sort of structural debate that needs to happen hopefully in the not too distant future. I stop there. Thank you so much, Nicola.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just want to say this is a terrific crowd. These were great questions. I don't think there is another group of people in the world who could have answered with one voice Coptic Christian when I made that mistake about Boutros Boutros-Ghali, which is terrific. So I really appreciate your questions and interventions.
Yeah, thanks. We have to come to an end, unfortunately. I think there would have been many more questions. We could have pursued a whole lot more in all kinds of directions, but I think there have been so many interesting ideas out on the table on what really shapes up to be a very complicated process in which what we hope to see in a Secretary General may not really come to pass, because not everybody has the same hopes for a strong organization. So clearly we need someone who can steer the UN through these troubled waters and bring it out at the end somewhat in a stronger situation than it is now, potentially. Kind of who that might be, we can't quite know. Obviously, we'd hope that kind of we would have again a Secretary General from the House. Kofi Annan was an alumnus, so we already had one. But of course, maybe we have higher aspirations. It might not happen this time. Rafael Grossi, of course, is not a woman, so we kind of. He's from Latin America, though. But I call on all the others here in the room to prepare yourselves and take on the challenge to stand for Secretary General at some point in the future. I wish you the best of luck. So for everybody else who is not planning that, I think we have lots of questions, lots of things to observe over the next year, kind of in terms of the election of the Secretary General. And so I all invite you to stay tuned and give a strong round of applause to our panelists who've really done a great job.